To look back in the past is to develop an understanding and generate skill in historical inquiry as a basis for understanding ourselves, our identity, our society, and our world in order to inform how we might act or shape our society in the future. A big welcome from us here at Shaw Academy. And an even bigger welcome from me, your course educator, Robin Santini. Welcome to your lesson 8, everyone. This is the last lesson of your module 1. So well done for getting this far. I'm sure it's been an exciting journey, but definitely a challenging one. But I can assure you it's only going to get better with what I have installed for you in module 2. In our final lesson for this module, we tie everything up with what we've learned in the past 7 lessons by looking at our design timeline in history. We use this to identify the styles that have been created from the influences within various time periods. Let's take a look at the core learning objectives for today's lesson. Firstly, we look at understanding the design timeline as we journey through the design history. We get a contextual understanding of the profession of interior design within design history. And lastly, we gain an understanding of the history of design and how it's influenced us as designers and the way we design today. As we know and as we've learned through this module, the practice of interior design shapes our lifestyles and the day-to-day functions. Each of our functions and daily practices bring about a form of cultural identity, which is shaped through certain influences within our history. Why do you think we look at history of design? Why do you think it is such an important topic to cover to become an interior designer? Studying history enables us to develop an understanding of the world in which we live in today. Building knowledge and understanding of historical events and trends, especially over the past century, enables us to develop as much of a greater appreciation for current events of today. The history of design is like a memory book that records behavior and influences throughout the years. Much like looking through the pictures of ourselves when we were children, we observe influences, traditions, and how we have adapted and developed through the years. The history of design functions in a similar fashion. The history of design reflects our traditions, customs through the built environment. It also creates a base for us to understand interior design, and it takes a role not only in developing a base for our profession, but also assists us in developing a contextual understanding of the profession. From ancient Egyptians to modern interior design, here is everything you need to know about where interior design originated from. Think back along your timeline of your history and try to think about what events in your past have shaped you as the person you are today. For example, you may wear certain clothing types now because you found the practicality and the functional aspects within them today. You may eat a certain food type more now than you did before, as you developed or acquired a taste for it now. Do any of you have any of these interesting stories to tell me as how history has shaped the way you are today? Let's take a look at the timeline of design that reflects our interior design history, dating as far back as the Stone Age. We start off with the basics and the primary features of the Stone Age and move right the way to the Baroque period, where we see the progression from practical and functional to the inclusion of decor and aesthetics. We then touch on the Rococo style and your neoclassical style in a little bit more depth, and then move our way all the way to the Victorian period, where we see the ruling of Queen Victoria and how the church influenced these styles. From Victorian era, we move along through arts and crafts. We touch on a little bit of the colonial revival and eclectic period as we progress all the way to our contemporary style. So can you guys remember some of these styles were covered in our previous styles lesson? Keep that information handy, as it's going to help you answer some of the questions I have lined up for you in this lesson. Now we've covered what styles and periods we're going to be looking at for this lesson. Let's get going. We start off with our Stone Age period. Before interior design became a prominent profession and a prominent role in the way we use and function within a space, we see that decor and architecture took preference. Before we look at the profession and the designers that are recognized today, we need to take a look back at the start, at the beginning of it all. And that is how we get to the Stone Age. The Stone Age is dated from 6000 to 2000 BC. How do we first see interior design becoming incorporated into the architecture and design of the Stone Age? Well, to be able to do this, we need to look at some of the characteristics of the architecture during this period. Firstly, we see features of flora and fauna within the architecture and design. We then start to notice the material usage within this time, which was of mud, animal skins, and sticks. They used this material to build their structures and dwellings of the time. We then notice that the main function of dwellings and homes during this time was that of practical use. So it was practical and functional, and that was the reason these structures were built. We see signs of decor through the use of artwork that was drawn onto the walls, such as artwork of animals and artwork of humans. I think we all know that during the Stone Age, the inhabitants were limited to what they were able to get their hands on for the construction purposes. Have a look at this rendition of homes from the Stone Age. Can you see that although they may not have thought about aesthetics, there is a clear focus on the function of the design? The home is performing one specific function. Can any of you tell me what it is? You know the drill. Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box at the right-hand corner of your screen. What is the function of this home? So the function of this home is providing shelter. Remember, we spoke about design and the need of design to have a focus on function. Well, here is where it all began. Do you see how interior design has much more of a responsibility than aesthetic appeal alone? This is, however, not to say that aesthetics are not important, but function definitely needs to play the primary role. And this is where it all began. This is where we start with our interior design journey, right from the beginning of function within a space. We now dive into the ancient Egyptian period, which ran from 2700 to 30 BC. While the typical homes in this ancient Egyptian period were that of mud huts, Your royals and your wealthier families lived in large, magnificent structures, showing off their wealth and their elegance of the time. In their homes, we observe murals that portray their history and their beliefs. We also start to see the basic use of decor in the way that they furnished and used decorative objects and sculptures within their spaces. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of the architecture of the time. Firstly, we see the use of posts and lintels within all of the construction of ancient Egyptians. We see the use of large walls covered with hieroglyphics and pictorial carvings. All of the buildings and all of the architecture had flat roofs, and you see a lot of large structures such as the pyramids. The pyramids are iconic to the ancient Egyptian timeline. Houses were built of clay or baked brick. Are you starting to see how function of a space is what takes preference when we start our interior design journey? This is the core and the foundation to interior design. Have you ever seen pictures of Stonehenge? Well, then you've seen examples of Neolithic architecture. The Neolithic age was the last period of the Stone Age, which encapsulated the beginning of human history. The Neolithic era is the period when Neolithic technology was present in Europe. This is the period where developments in farming and agriculture started to boom. An important development of this time was that farming was the core activity and main income generator, and this obviously had a huge impact on architecture and design of the time. People in the Neolithic age lived in permanent structures, unlike the caves and huts of the Stone Age era. Most of the people during this period lived in built homes. A common element within a home during this time was that each home was generally built around a central point, and this point was generally the fireplace. The fireplace was used to create warmth and used for cooking purposes in homes. At the beginning of this period, homes were usually single rooms, but as it progressed towards the end of the period, they grew into many rooms, even double-story homes. It was thanks to the Neolithic period that we see double-story homes and houses. So let's take a recap of the Neolithic period and look at some of the primary architectural characteristics of this period. Firstly, we know that the homes were rectangular. Homes, whether they were one room or two room, always had a rectangular shape to them. Secondly, their homes were created out of mud brick, as this was a cheap material to use at the time. Each home generally had one door and no windows. There was one entry point and generally no windows within a home. A common characteristic of this period is that we start to see handmade pottery. Handmade pottery was not only used for functional purposes, but decorative too. This is where we see the first handmade pottery in our timeline. The next stop on our journey of our interior design timeline is our Greek and our Roman Empire. Here is where we first start to see some signs of extravagance, beauty, and displays of wealth. During the Greek Empire, which dated from 1231 BC, we see improvements in civilization and lifestyle, which made it affordable and more accessible for people to decorate their homes in their own unique style. We start to see the wealthier Greeks showcasing furnishings with ornate ivory and silver detailings. Some of the key characteristics of this Greek Empire period were the use of pillars and columns and motifs in the construction of their buildings. Let's look at a fun fact of this era. Can any of you tell me Which famous architectural piece comes from the Greek Empire? Let me know. Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. Do any of you know which famous architectural piece comes from this era? Well, it's the Parthenon. It's an incredibly famous building in Greece. Then we move on to our Roman Empire, which dates from 753 BC to 480 AD. During this Roman Empire, we see that it wasn't enough for wealthier class to show their wealth and power through their homes, but also through their decor. Decor such as murals, mosaics, and extravagant furnishings were used within their interior spaces. In both these periods, we see characteristics of large columns and grand buildings. We see the use of silver, gold, and ivory in all of their interior spaces, and we see the inclusion of art and heavy detailing. The next stops we look at on our timeline is the Byzantine and Dark Ages era. Let's start off with our Byzantine era, which dates from 500 to 1500 AD, which features the use of grand domes and extravagant decor within the spaces. This becomes a custom and a norm of the time. Byzantine architecture is a style of buildings that flourished under the rule of the Roman Emperor. In addition to extravagant use of interior mosaics, its defining characteristic is a heightened dome. Much of what we call Byzantine architecture today is ecclesiastical, which means church. So a lot of the architecture of the time was built around the church. Next, we take a look at the Dark Ages, which extends from 900 to 1100 AD. This era follows the decline of the Roman Empire. As we see a deterioration of the economy and culture in Europe, so do we see the same influence in interior design and architecture of the time. We observe the fall of interior design or interior decor as we go back to basics. People start opting for simple furnishings and finishes of the home, right from wooden paneling, minimal furnishing, to stone and slab flooring. We look at how the Byzantine era showcases wealth and ornate pieces, and then we move to the Dark Ages, and we see as if the wealth has been drained from the interiors and the architecture. Can you see how the culture and lifestyle and economy has a direct impact on interior design and architecture even back then? Here is an example of an interior from the Dark Ages. As we know, this era is all about deterioration of economy, culture, and design within Europe. Just imagine what you would do if your financial situation was dire. Your focus would be on anything other than decor. Function is your primary thought here. Can you see how function becomes the primary focus in this interior? Everything has been stripped back right to function. It's very stark and very dark, which is a common characteristic of this period. Let's look at some of the other characteristics we can see. So in this image, we can see clearly that they've gone back to basics. They've adopted a minimalism approach or a minimalist style. We can also see the use of stone and timber flooring. So you can see how they've used stone on their floors and stone on their fireplace. And then obviously a lot of timber within the decor and furnishings. The next period stop on our interior design timeline is our Gothic style or Gothic period. During the Gothic style, we start to see strong influence of architecture and interior design joining in harmony. This Gothic period is in direct response to the Dark Ages, as we start to see a revival of decorative ornamentation and bold coloring. During this period, we observe the inclusion of large windows, an increase in natural light, and the space planning of opened planned floor plans. Remember when we learned about styles and how they developed due to an era and the needs that arose within these eras? Well, the Gothic style is one of these styles that you may see in buildings today. This style can be characterized by a couple of key architectural elements. Do you know what they are? Let's take a look. Firstly, we know that in the Gothic period, they use a lot of stained glass and large windows. Have a look at the example image. Can you see the stained glass windows here? The next characteristic we look at is the fact that they have painted arches. They also use a lot of ribbed vaulted ceilings. We see the inclusion of flying buttresses. And last but not least, we see the inclusion of ornate decor. This Gothic period is an incredibly interesting period and one I encourage you to investigate further. The next style periods we look at on our timeline are our Renaissance and our Baroque period. The Renaissance period dates from 1400 to 1600 AD. During the Renaissance period, we see a strong influence of interior decor through the use of grand artworks, vibrant colors, and luxurious textures. Some of the textures we see in this period are our marbles, our velvets, and our silks. This is the period where we see the enjoyment of lush and vibrant spaces. The beauty in this era is in interior decor. This was the element that was prized during the Renaissance period. Carpets were another feature that were characterized during this period. However, due to the fact that carpet was so expensive, and since carpets were too precious, they were used in artwork situations where possible. So, for example, you'll see a lot of carpets hung on the walls. Here's a fun fact about the Renaissance period that you can add to your research. It was during this time that Michelangelo created his amazing work in the Sistine Chapel. Have any of you seen Michelangelo's work? Well, something to research a little bit further. Then we move on to the Baroque period, which dates from 1590 to 1725 AD. During our Baroque period, we see the longevity in ornate features and the enjoyment of lush interior spaces. Some of the characteristics included in this period: stained glass windows, twisted columns, colored marbles, painted ceilings, and mirrors, as well as oversized chandeliers. Additional characteristics we see during our Baroque period are flamboyant interiors, artistic expression, and the use of materials such as glass, columns, marble, and excessive color. Having wrapped up our Renaissance and Baroque period, we jump to our traditional and Rococo periods. These are the next two styles in our history timeline of interior design. Both of these periods come in around about during the 1700s AD. The difference between these two periods is that the traditional style of this time is still prevalent today, whereas your Rococo style has faded away. Some of the characteristics of our traditional style include the following. It incorporates a rich history. Our traditional interior design is a broad term that highlights varied design styles. As I've mentioned above, it has a rich history contrasted with very modern design features. Quite an interesting element of our traditional style is that it highlights 18th and 19th century European decor. Because of this, it becomes quite a timeless design style that we still see today. It also brings about a sense of comfort and glamour to a space. It would be ideal for someone who appreciates antiques, classic art, symmetry, and a rich design history. Having tackled our traditional style, let's look at some of the characteristics of our Rococo style. Our Rococo style developed first in our decorative arts and interior design sector, and then later its influence spread to architecture, sculpture, theater, design, painting, and music. Rococo style is characterized by an elaborate ornamentation, asymmetrical values, a pastel palette or color scheme, and the use of curved lines. Rococo style has such a rich history and such an impact on interior design today. Let's take a look at it in a little bit more detail. Its elegant, flirty, luxurious, and playful features are geared towards exquisite bedrooms, salons, and easy living rooms. Your Rococo style in interior design was used to emphasize the high status and excellent taste expressed in the love for detail, carefully thought out combinations of furniture and interior design. That being said, let's look at some of the characteristics of the style in a little bit more detail. Firstly, we know that the color palette was pastel colors with hints of golds, and your colors in this era would have been light pinks, creams, light blues, light shades of purple and green and beiges, and you would even have seen hints of peach, pearl, and cream colors. The next characteristic we look at is the material use. They used materials such as light natural timbers, elegant fabrics such as your silk, satin, and velvets. We see a lot of crystal and glass and metal elements such as bronze, brass, and copper. This was a very spacious style and spacious era which incorporated elegance and comfort within their rooms. We see an excessive use of decorative elements such as your mirrors, paintings, and massive frames. Rococo tends to be a mythological and erotic subject and erotic style. Images and figures of nymphs, cupids, dryads, ancient gods and goddesses are seen in all of the architecture and decor within the style. We also see the basis of the style being asymmetry. It uses smooth lines, rounded forms, and decorative, ornate detailing. Have a look at this example of a Rococo style. Can you list some of the design characteristics that we've just looked at that are key to the Rococo period? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. These are some of the elements that you should have picked up. Firstly, we see the pastel color palette being used within the space. We get a sense that this is quite an elegant, luxurious space or interior. I can see the use of gold detailing within the furniture. And last but not least, we see touches of floral and botanical within the design elements, as you can see on the furnishing and the wall detailing. Our next stop on our timeline is our Industrial Revolution era. During the Industrial Revolution era from 1760 to 1820 AD, we see that interior design and decor became more widely accessible as luxurious elements of the time became more affordable. The Industrial Revolution was an influential era, as we see the shift in the way architects designed and created their buildings. In this period, we also see the revival of the Gothic, Renaissance, and Classical design eras. This is also largely due to the fact that printing started becoming more affordable, which created a wide distribution of fashion and lifestyle publications, and the fact that luxury items became increasingly attainable to the working class. After our Industrial Revolution era, we start to see our neoclassical period, which dated from 1780 to 1880 AD. This period drew its inspiration within design and architecture from the ancient cultures of the Greek and Roman Empire. This was done with the use of grand, ornate features and decorative gold detailing. So if you remember a couple of slides back, we looked at our Greek and Roman Empire. And typical features in that period were the use of ornate and decorative detailing and grandiose features and columns. Characteristics of this era include: in the furniture and furnishings of this era, it incorporates bronze and gold metalling. We also see the use of soft furnishing features such as silk, velvet, and satin, so your fabrics become quite lush and soft during this time period. We start to see a trend of matching wallpaper and furnishings. This period allowed homeowners to place a big focus on your function of their home with the inclusion of design and decor, as items became more accessible and more affordable to the middle class. Can you see in this example how we see the use of gold and bronze detailing? We also have a little bit of the domed features coming from our Greek and Roman Empire as well. We now move across to the tropical and aesthetic periods. The tropical period is a really exciting period as we start to see the inclusion of tropical pieces from West Indies and India in the homes of the British. This was largely due to the fact that the British Empire was growing in these countries during the 1800s, and because of this, the exposure to trends and architectures of India and West Indies was huge. The aesthetics movement is next on our list, which is prevalent from the 1800s. A popular saying developed during this time, which was art for art's sake. This was a movement where radicals expressed their defiance against the current dry interior design style of the time. The key here was practicality and function, which took importance before beauty. So we can start to see quite a trend throughout history of how practicality took front line. The next stop on our timeline is our Victorian era, which dates from 1837 to 1901 AD. This period marks the reign of England's Queen Victoria. During this period, we also see the demise of rural life as cities rapidly grow and expand. Due to the growth in civilization, we start to see the culture of long, hard-working factory hours increase, the start of the war, and the era of Jack the Ripper. Generally, most Victorian architecture can be described as dollhouse-like. Most Victorian buildings were brick, with large interior staircases and windows, balconies and fireplaces in almost every room. Let's take a look at some of the typical characteristics this period included. Firstly, as we know, dollhouse-like architecture was prominent. Each home or each interior space included bright colors and asymmetrical designs. Most of the architecture was created with brick, as this was the most accessible material of the time. Houses typically had large staircases with windows and fireplaces in almost every room. Usually pieces of furniture that the homeowner had collected during their lifetime became focal points within the space. And another interesting characteristic of the time is that color was focused on function within a space. So this is exactly what we spoke about in our color lesson, how color has a psychology within a room. As you can see, the Victorian period was an incredibly interesting one, and I think one of the main features we can take away from this is that it had doll-like architecture. That being said, we move on to our next era, the Tuscan era. The Tuscan style is all in its name, dating from the 1840s to current period. This style is still in use today. It's heavily reliant on the simplicity and the elegance and the relaxed feel of the Italian style to date. Some of the characteristics we can see in this period included the following. It was influenced by an Italian style. It had incredibly simplistic features, elegant style, and luxurious interiors. The Tuscan style creates a sense of warmth and correct ergonomic placement within a space. As you can see in this example image, it's a really warm, comforting, and cozy space that the Tuscan style creates. Before we go any further, let's take a quick look at the styles that we've covered so I haven't lost you. Can anyone remember which period was characterized by the stained glass windows? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. This was the Gothic period. This came after the revival of interior design, after we moved away from the Dark Ages. Which period was influenced by the colonialization of the West Indies and India? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. It was the tropical period. So as you can see, we've covered our Stone Age period right the way to our Victorian era, which dates from 1837 to 1901 AD. So here's a question for you. Can you tell me, after having had a look at our first periods on our timeline, in which period did we first see the inclusion of pottery, not only for functional use, but for decorative as well? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. I'm going to give you a minute or two to think that one over. Which period on our timeline did we first see the inclusion of pottery? The correct answer is your Neolithic period. This is when we first see signs of pottery coming into our decor during our Neolithic period. Then we move away to our arts and craft period, dating from 1860 to 1910 AD. This movement of interior design came about as people were opposed to industrialism. It was the movement of people producing their own unique furniture and decor items. Remember, during our Industrial Revolution, we had mass production of products and elements. You can imagine everyone having the same items in their living rooms or in their kitchens. During our arts and crafts era, this is what people were opposing. In simple terms, this era is all about arts and crafts. Yes, again, all in the name. Literally, arts and crafts, producing one's own furniture. The core characteristics of this arts and crafts movement are a belief in craftsmanship, which stresses the inherent beauty of the material, the importance of nature as an inspiration, and the value of simplicity, utility, and beauty. As you can see, and as we start to move through each period, you start to see the complexity growing within architecture and design, which brings us to our next period, the rustic period and Art Nouveau period. Your rustic period runs from 1870s to current, and your Art Nouveau period runs from 1890 to 1910 AD. Piggybacking off our arts and crafts, our rustic theme has a handcrafted feel to it, as its design characteristics and common elements. The featured characteristics of this period include handcrafted furniture and large open rooms. Wooden beams and columns open up rooms to allow airy flow and feel within this style. Then we look at our Art Nouveau period, which was all about bringing in natural silhouettes. These were from our botanical features and elements, which brought in curved lines and organic shapes. This was signature and was a signature element and characteristic to this period. Have a look at the image and example of our Art Nouveau period. Can you see on the floor and the curved lines of the staircase how the organic shape is being brought into the space? So I can see organic shape here on our floor, on our staircase, and on our ceiling. The next two stops on our interior design timeline are our eclectic period and our colonial revival period. We start off with our colonial revival period, which dates from 1905 to current day. This period was popularized in the US, where styles from the neoclassical and the Georgian period were revived and influenced the colonial period to date. This was said to be brought on by the Continental Exhibition, the arrival of the automobile, which allowed people to travel freely, relive and revisit historical sites with ease. So picture this, suddenly people are traveling all across the country with ease. Imagine the influence that they are picking up through their travels. Have a look at this image and see why you think this is such a popular style. It's all about the classic proportions within this period and the flexibility within the detailing. In this image, have a look at the fireplace detailing and see how the fireplace mantle resembles a little mini classical temple. It's beautiful, it's ornate, but it works. As exciting as the colonial revival period is, we need to take a look at our eclectic period, which dates from the 1900s to now. This is one of my favorite periods, as this is the period where design styles become a prominent conversation topic amongst design enthusiasts and designers themselves. Some of the characteristics we see of this period include lavish interiors, the rise of interior designers as a skill in mixing different styles. We see the harmony of styles within a space. We see the use of juxtapositioning textures. There is a wide use of contrasting colors, which is used to create cohesive, beautiful spaces within our interior. This period is also all about experimentation and playing with color and style. Next, we jump into our modernism period, which took place from 1918 to the 1950s. Modernism is a global architecture and design movement which emerged during the 1980s, as we said. This emerged as a response to the accelerated industrialization and the social changes that were happening at the time. This era was all about pursuing order within architecture and design. In the era of modernism, new materials and advanced technologies rejected what was old, rejected traditional historical ideas and styles. Modernism emphasized function, simplicity, rationality, and created new form of expression, a new aesthetic movement. Modern buildings were characterized by clean lines, simple geometric shape, functional, flexible, open interior space planning. Some of the typical characteristics of this period included the following: a movement towards minimalism and under-furnished interiors. It incorporated a very neutral color palette and color scheme. Some of the materials that were commonly used were plastic, steel, and laminate. And last but not least, we see a common characteristic that the floor blended from one room to another, so the same floor finish was used across multiple rooms. After our modern period, we move on to the period of country, which dates from 1920 to 1970. This is also quite a fun and straightforward period, which produced a style that is still very popular today. The country period, or the country style, was inspired by farmhouse style and the practicality of the use with each space. The country style was practical, but had the inclusion of quality, vintage-inspired furnishings. Let's take a look at some of the typical characteristics of this style and see if you can visualize them in the example image on the left-hand side. One of the main characteristics is a farmhouse-inspired theme. One of the second characteristics is that it incorporated large open spaces. One of my favorite characteristics, and a characteristic that we've been picking up right through from Stone Age all the way to our country era, is the practical use of a space, the function and practicality of your interior spaces. We see the use of partial vintage furnishings. And last but not least, we see natural resources and elements such as timber in our interior spaces. Our next stop is Art Deco, which is probably one of the most well-known periods in our history book to date. How many of you have heard about Art Deco? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. Art Deco is a beautiful style that can be seen in many architectural sites to date. This style was popular from 1920s to the 1960s. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics that classified architecture of this period. Firstly, we see that it was obviously a well-known interior design style. We see that each interior space has been designed with elegance and glamour. There's an extreme use of clean, bold lines. We see the use of bold color. So have a look at this image. One of the bold colors that pop out in this image is that royal blue. We see the use of angular shapes and objects and form. There's a strong use of stylized patterns within this era. And last but not least, we see the use of lavish ornaments. So in this example, you can see one of the lavish ornaments is your lighting detail and chandelier at the top. The next stop on our timeline is our mid-century modern and our transitional period. Our mid-century modern dates from the 1920s to now. Can you remember we covered this style in our styles lesson? We also covered some of the important characteristics of our mid-century modern style. Can any of you tell me what they are? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. For those of you who are struggling, here are some of the characteristics that you should have picked up. Firstly, there is a lean towards simplicity and clean lines within furniture and architecture. We see the movement towards quality craftsmanship. There's a strong use of natural woods and natural finishes within each interior space. We see the combination of natural and man-made elements, plus a strong use of geometric prints and bold coloring. Then we jump across to our transitional period, which dates from 1950s to current. This is a classic style with a modern take. The aim of this style is to be timeless by combining old and new design and decor elements. It's an inclusive period as we see more and more traditional elements within the furniture pieces and ornaments. Let's recap some of the characteristics of this transitional period. Firstly, we see that it's a classic with a modern take type of style. It's a very timeless style as it combines old and new elements. It's a style focused on decor and simplicity, with using ornate and traditional elements within the space. Given what we know of the transitional period, can you name some of the characteristics of this style based on the example in the picture on your screen? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. These are some of the items that you should have picked up. Firstly, we see classic with a modern take of soft, comfortable fabrics in combination with the structured and solid lines within the space. We also see the use of timeless inclusions. So, for instance, in this case, your timeless inclusion would be your color palette, so the timeless use of colors. Lastly, but not least, we see the combination or the inclusion of ornate and traditional pieces. As we start to get towards the end of our timeline, we dive into our contemporary period, which also taps into our contemporary style. So I'm not sure if any of you can remember, but in our styles lesson, we did look at a little bit of the contemporary style and characteristics that are associated with the contemporary style. As we know, the contemporary period came into play in the 1980s and is still current now. Contemporary interior design is able to represent a sense of the now without having the strict guidelines of modernism. Can any of you remember some of those characteristics that we covered in our contemporary style? You can pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. These are some of the characteristics that you should be picking up. Firstly, it's a style that has very comfortable living spaces. Secondly, it's got an inclusion of straight and curved lines. We also see the use of smooth, clean lines within these interiors, plus the inclusion of geometric shapes. There's a lot of use of accented features in the space through the use of bold coloring and asymmetrical balance. Let's have a think back to some of the periods we've just covered. Can any of you tell me which period there was a strong focus on craftsmanship? What is the correct answer? You can pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. The correct answer is your arts and crafts period. Why? Because people were tired of mass production. They were tired of the mass-produced look and feel within their interiors. People were looking for quality and the homemade feel within their spaces. And that brings us to the challenge for today's lesson. So your challenge is to choose one of the periods from the lesson that most resonates with you. Take that period and research the characteristics of the design style. you can elaborate on what we've just covered. Choose an interior from that specific design period and apply the characteristics that are associated with that period. So you can do this in a similar style to the way you tackled your challenge for your style lesson. Post your findings onto your Instagram page and use the following hashtags. Firstly, your tag at Shaw Academy, and then your hashtag Shaw Interior Designs. And for this lesson challenge, we're going to use hashtag Shaw ID Challenge History, because obviously we're covering history in today's lesson. So in summary, what we're trying to do in this challenge is to become masters of a specific style period. Develop your style period. So for example, if you chose Rococo style, take that style, go and research it so you've got as much information as you could possibly know on the Rococo period. Print a photograph of that interior, put it in your sketchbook, and make as many notes of the characteristics of that space as possible. Photograph it, as we always do, and post your findings onto Instagram and Facebook. So as we're nearing to the end of our Module 1, I want to do a little recap of the challenges and challenge hashtags that we've covered in your module. Please make sure that you're keeping up with your challenges, as they're going to help you with your final module assessment and your portfolio that you'll be creating at the end of your course. Here are some of the hashtags you can use to add to your Instagram account. Firstly, ID Challenge 2, hashtag ID Challenge 3. We then had Shaw ID Challenge Style, which was all about your styles and your style lesson. Our next one was hashtag Shaw Interior Design. So this hashtag you can use for all your challenges. It's just a general hashtag and it keeps everything filed quite nicely. Our next hashtag was Shaw ID Challenge Rendering, and that was our practical lesson where we learned to hand render our floor plans. And for this one, we are using hashtag Shaw ID Challenge History for our history lesson. And then obviously you can tag us at Shaw Academy or tag me at Shaw Interior Design. As we draw nearer towards the end of our lesson, let's take a look back and see how far we've come. In our Module 1, we've covered everything to do with sketching and sketching techniques, right up to sketching your own communication drawings. Remember what we've learned? You do not need to be a Michelangelo to be an interior designer. As long as what? Can any of you tell me? As long as you have communicated what you need to communicate to your client. That is a very important lesson to take from your Module 1. We then have sketched our plans, elevations, and perspective views, and even learned how to create realistic hand renders in our Let's Get Coloring lesson. We've become masters in the use of color and how each color tone and each color variation affects the psychological value of a space. We have become proficient in our style categories, as we know each characteristic relating to each style type. We are only getting stronger as we dive into our Module 2, where we are going to learn all about our client, how to create client briefs, and how to take our client briefs. We also learn about the people and what we're going to come into contact with along our design journey. I can only promise you a lot of excitement as we dive into our Module 2. Remember guys that you're always able to go back and re-watch lessons. You may pick up different bits of information in every new viewing. Nothing solidifies learning like repetition. You can also access all of your summary notes, summary slides, and videos on your course page and course dashboard. I'm sure most of you are excited to see how far you've come in the lessons as we've built up on the fundamentals along the way. You can see how we've really built up on our history and the knowledge of design styles. Our understanding of elements and principles has been solidified, applied, and we've identified these within design types and design scenarios. Our presentational design is starting to come along as we start to look at application and execution of these presentational designs. But as we develop and as we progress into Module 2, 3, and 4, we will start to really tap into these skills. You are now able to access your module assignment. This will be your first assignment for your course, and it will count 25% towards your casework. It will also go towards you obtaining your professional diploma in interior design. You have now mastered so many of the basic skill sets and skills, but you need to go on to your Module 2, 3, and 4 to complete your diploma and really ramp up your skill level for interior design. After wrapping up, that brings us to the end of our Lesson 8. That being said, we have officially finished your Module 1 in your diploma in interior design. Well done, everyone, for getting this far. You can be so proud of yourselves. I am so proud of everyone. Keep up the hard work. Happy learning, and we will see you for your Lesson 1 of Module 2. Happy learning. Good luck, everyone, and see you soon.